The room was silent except for the metallic clatter of instruments being arranged on a tray. A single light bulb swung gently above, throwing harsh shadows across whitewashed walls stained with memories no soap could ever cleanse. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, sharp and chemical, but beneath it was another odor, heavier, impossible to ignore, the musk of sweat, fear, and blood. On the table lay a man, wrists and ankles strapped down with leather bindings. His chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, the shallow breathing of someone who knew escape was impossible. Around him, men in white coats moved with precision. They did not look at his face. To them, he was not a man at all, only a subject, only a number, only a log. The scalpel glinted under the light, and for a moment the room held its breath. Then steel met flesh. Imagine, for one unbearable moment, that you are that man. Imagine hearing your own muffled cries bounce back at you from the walls, realizing that the people surrounding you are not torturers in uniforms, but doctors. Men who had once sworn to save life, now intent on carving yours open while it still clung to your bones. This was not the nightmare of a single prisoner. It was the reality of thousands. And it happened not in medieval dungeons or far-off legends, but in the 20th century, under the banner of science. This was Unit 731. At first, even the name sounds clinical, almost harmless. Unit 731 could belong to any military research department, some secret office shuffling papers or tinkering with equipment. But behind that sterile designation was one of the darkest laboratories the world has ever known, a place where medical knowledge was not used to heal, but to perfect suffering, where human beings were treated as disposable material, dissected alive, frozen solid, infected deliberately, and destroyed in the pursuit of knowledge that no society should ever have sought. The location was Harbin, a city in northeast China occupied by Imperial Japan in the 1930s. Behind guarded gates and barbed wire, the compound sprawled across acres like a factory of silence. From the outside, it might have looked like any military base. Barracks, smokestacks, neat rows of buildings. But inside its walls, the ordinary dissolved into the grotesque. Men and women dragged from their homes, peasants, soldiers, the poor, the sick, even children, found themselves reduced to logs. That was the term Japanese scientists used, maruta. It was easier to speak of logs than to acknowledge the living souls they bound, cut open, and discarded. The cruelty was not wild, uncontrolled, or impulsive. It was systematic. Each step was written down, each wound catalogued, each death observed with the detachment of laboratory research. In that way, it was worse than random violence. Violence can be irrational, chaotic. What happened here was methodical, deliberate, justified under the banner of progress. That is why the silence in the room felt so heavy. These men in white coats were not shouting, not jeering. They were calm, focused, professional. They might have been preparing to mend a wound. Instead, they were creating one.
Think about the contradiction for a moment. A doctor's tools, scalpels, clamps, sutures are meant to preserve life. In Harbin, those same tools became instruments of terror. The sight of a gleaming scalpel on a tray normally promises relief, a path back to health. Here, it promised agony, a journey into which the only certainty was that the patient would never rise again. How do we process a world where the very symbols of healing are inverted so completely? Where the steady hands of surgeons were not shaking with guilt, but steady because they believed they were serving a greater cause. The truth is unsettling. The men who created Unit 731 did not think of themselves as monsters. They thought of themselves as pioneers. They believed they were building an empire, securing victory, and proving Japan's place as a scientific power. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Evil here did not wear the face of madness, but of rationality. It wore a uniform, held degrees, and walked confidently through sterile hallways, convinced it was on the side of progress. The man strapped to the table could see none of this. All he knew was the cold sting of metal on his skin, the sickening pressure as blades cut deeper, the horror of being fully conscious while his body was unmade. Some prisoners prayed, others cursed. Many simply fell silent, their voices spent, their minds unable to process what was happening. In the end, the silence always returned, the silence of the room, the silence of the doctors' faces, the silence of a death that would never be recorded by name. If you find yourself wanting to turn away, to distance your mind from the image, that instinct is natural. It is easier to close the door than to step inside and confront what happened. But if history teaches us anything, it is that closing the door is what allows such rooms to exist in the first place. The people of Harbin lived near this compound. They smelled the smoke from its chimneys. They whispered about its barbed wire, but they did not know the depth of what lay beyond. Only later did fragments emerge, testimonies leaked, survivors spoke, and the world began to comprehend the scale of what had been hidden. So let us keep the door open for just a moment longer. Imagine the echo of footsteps in that corridor, the sharp knock of boots against concrete, the flicker of the light bulb above the table. Imagine the way fear thickened the air, the way every sound was magnified, the scrape of metal, the tightening of straps, the intake of breath before the cut. This was daily routine inside Unit 731, not an exception, not an accident, but a procedure repeated over and over, perfected like an industrial process.
Shiro Ishii, a doctor-turned-soldier whose obsession with germs would redefine warfare. Brilliant yet ruthless, he believed disease could conquer cities more effectively than bombs. His vision of weaponized plague and cholera was as audacious as it was terrifying. But the greater horror was not the procedure itself. It was how easily ordinary men turned cruelty into routine. Behind the barbed wire of Unit 731, life was reduced to something smaller than survival. For those trapped inside, existence became a waiting game played on borrowed time. Every sunrise was another reminder that death could come at any moment. Sudden, calculated, and often disguised as routine. The prisoners of Unit 731 came from every corner of Japan's growing empire. Chinese peasants from nearby villages were the most numerous, rounded up without warning in the middle of the night. Some were accused of sheltering resistance fighters. Others were taken at random, their only crime being that they lived under occupation. Korean nationalists, captured in raids, found themselves dragged north and thrown into cells. Soviet prisoners of war, captured on the Manchurian front, were marched through the gates in chains. And sometimes, Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Australians, arrived too, their uniforms stripped, their identities erased. All were swallowed by the compound. All became logs. That word, Maruta, still chills the air decades later. To the guards and scientists, it was easier to think of prisoners as lumber stacked in a yard rather than as fathers, mothers, children. By calling them logs, they could be measured, cut, and discarded without guilt. It was dehumanization in its most deliberate form. And once you stop calling someone human, almost anything can be justified. Inside the compound, the prisoners were crammed into bare, concrete cells. The walls were damp with the sweat of too many bodies and too little air. In winter, the icy winds of Manchuria seeped through cracks, numbing fingers and turning breath into mist. In summer, the heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it the stench of waste and disease. Rations were meager. Watery soup, stale bread, a handful of rice if one was lucky. Hunger gnawed constantly, hollowing faces until every cheekbone protruded, every rib was visible beneath the skin. Some prisoners tried to savor each grain of rice,
rolling it on their tongues as if stretching out the taste might make the hunger hurt less. It never did. What made daily life unbearable was not only the hunger or the cold, but the uncertainty. At any moment, a guard could appear and call for prisoners to be removed. Sometimes they were taken in groups, sometimes alone. The rest of the cellmates would watch silently, knowing they would never see that person again. Whispers would circle about what awaited them: vivisection, frostbite experiments, infection. Each disappearance deepened the terror of those who remained. Prisoners lived in a state of suspended dread, waiting for the knock at the door, the clang of keys, the footsteps that meant their time had come. Even within the camp, a hierarchy existed. Guards strutted about, with rifles slung casually across their shoulders. They barked orders, sometimes striking prisoners for no reason, other times dragging them by the hair across the yard. Above them were the scientists, the doctors in white coats. Unlike the guards, they did not raise their voices or swing their fists. Their authority came in silence, in the way they would stand outside a cell door, clipboard in hand, scanning the prisoners as though shopping for groceries. When their eyes stopped on someone, that person's fate was sealed. No guard was feared as much as a doctor who pointed. Among the prisoners themselves, fragments of humanity still flickered. In the darkness of cells, men and women whispered their names to each other, trying to hold on to identity in a place designed to erase it. Mothers tried to comfort their children, even as they starved. Older men told stories of their villages, describing rivers, mountains, and rice fields, as if painting home in words might remind them that life had once been different. Some prisoners shared scraps of food with those weaker than themselves, knowing it might shorten their own survival, but refusing to let compassion die entirely. In these small acts, resistance lived. But resistance had no chance against the machinery of the camp. Every morning, prisoners were driven into the courtyard for roll call. The gravel crunched under their bare feet, the cold wind cutting through their thin rags. They stood in rows while guards counted, recounted, shouted numbers. Hours could pass in this ritual, leaving lips blue, bodies trembling, and minds numb. It was not efficiency, but control. Roll call reminded prisoners that they were not people, but inventory, to be tallied and kept in order. Disease ran rampant through the cells. Lice crawled over skin, carrying fevers that spread like fire. Diarrhea weakened bodies already starving. Infections went untreated. Wounds festered. Prisoners coughed, wheezed, groaned, and sometimes simply fell silent. Death from illness became as common as death from experiments. Yet even sickness was not always an escape. Sometimes being ill made a prisoner more valuable as material for research. In the twisted logic of Unit 731, a body weakened by disease was not a tragedy, but an opportunity. Imagine the psychological torment of living in such a place. Every day was a paradox. To hope for life was to know that life meant more suffering. To hope for death was to betray the instinct to survive. And in that space between hope and despair, people lingered, clinging to fragments of dignity. Some prisoners carved tiny marks into the walls to count the days. Others murmured prayers under their breath. Some simply stared blankly, their minds retreating into silence as the only refuge left. The guards, too, played their part in shaping this daily terror. Many were young men, indoctrinated by propaganda, taught that the prisoners were enemies of the empire. They beat them, humiliated them, sometimes for amusement. A prisoner might be forced to kneel in the snow until his skin cracked, or to crawl across the yard while others watched. These acts were not punishment for crimes, but demonstrations of power, reminders that in this world, cruelty was the currency of authority. And yet, for all the brutality, there was also a strange normality. To the scientists and guards, the camp was not chaos. It was routine. Prisoners lined up. Experiments were scheduled. Reports were filed. Ashes rose from chimneys on predictable days. To live inside Unit 731 was to see horror normalized, transformed into part of the rhythm of daily life. That normalization may be the most terrifying detail of all, because it shows how easily human beings can adjust to the unimaginable when it is made ordinary. Consider how the prisoners themselves began to measure time, not in days or months, but in who was taken, who disappeared, whose cell fell silent. Each absence was a unit of memory, each vanishing a reminder of the fate awaiting everyone. In this way, death became the clock of Unit 731. It ticked forward with every knock on the cell door, every call of a name, every set of footsteps that faded into silence. Life in the camp was not truly life. It was the slow unraveling of humanity under the weight of hunger, disease, and dread. And yet, even here, flickers of defiance remained. A whispered name, a shared crust of bread, a memory spoken aloud in the darkness. These fragile gestures were not enough to stop the machine, but they were enough to remind us, decades later, that even in the most dehumanized spaces, people tried to remain people. The story of daily life in Unit 731 forces us to confront a brutal truth. Cruelty does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in silence, in routines, in the slow erosion of dignity. The prisoners of Harbin lived not in a whirlwind of violence, but in the suffocating monotony of fear, where each day was a repeat of the last until it ended in disappearance. And while the experiments themselves were acts of unspeakable horror, it was this daily existence, this grinding uncertainty, this endless waiting that wore down the soul. And still, the worst was yet to come. Because the roll calls, the hunger, the cold, these were only the prelude. What happened inside the laboratories, behind locked doors and under glaring lights, would turn suffering into spectacle, cruelty into research, and death into data. If daily life at Unit 731 stripped people of their humanity, the experiments that followed sought to erase even their memory. What unfolded in those laboratories was not only the destruction of bodies, but the annihilation of what it means to be human. The laboratories of Unit 731 were the beating heart of its horror. If the cells were the antechamber, this was the altar. Here, medicine and science were stripped of compassion and wielded as instruments of cruelty. Every corridor, every operating table, every notebook filled with tidy handwriting was part of a system that turned human beings into raw material for experiments that no ethics could ever defend. It is tempting to imagine that such things belong only to nightmares, that no rational person could design such procedures. But in Harbin, under the command of Shiro Ishii, this nightmare was systematized, scheduled, and carried out with clinical detachment. The most infamous of these experiments were the vivisections. Prisoners were strapped down on tables, conscious, unmedicated, and dissected alive. The doctors wanted to observe the living body, not the dead. They cut open chests to watch lungs inflate and deflate. They exposed stomachs to trace digestion. They sliced into arteries to measure how quickly blood poured from a wound. To study how organs failed, they removed parts while the victim still breathed. Some were infected with diseases first, plague, syphilis, anthrax, and then dissected so doctors could watch the infection spread organ by organ. Imagine lying there, eyes wide open, as the hands meant to heal peeled your body apart in the name of science. If vivisection was the most direct cruelty, frostbite testing was perhaps the most haunting. In the bitter winters of Manchuria, researchers wanted to study how cold destroyed the human body. Prisoners, often peasants from nearby villages, were marched outside in sub-zero temperatures. Their arms or legs were plunged into icy water or exposed to the wind until flesh froze solid. Sometimes the doctors would wait until the limb was literally clattering like wood when struck. Then they would attempt to thaw it, pouring hot water or using flames to see how tissue responded. The results were predictable: gangrene, blackened flesh, agony. Limbs swelled, burst, and sometimes snapped clean off. But this was precisely the point. The scientists wanted to know how long soldiers could survive in cold climates, how far frostbite could spread, and what methods of treatment were effective. The price was measured in human screams. Biological warfare experiments formed another core of Ishii's obsession. Prisoners were deliberately infected with some of the deadliest diseases known: plague, cholera, anthrax, syphilis, and typhoid. Sometimes pathogens were injected directly into their veins. Other times, food and water were contaminated. Victims were locked in cells, left to writhe in fever, convulsions, and slow death, while doctors charted every symptom in meticulous detail. Entire groups were exposed to different strains to test which spread fastest. Pregnant women were infected to observe the effects on unborn children. The cruelty was not just in the pain, but in the calculated patience, the willingness to watch someone suffer over weeks or months for the sake of data. Weapons testing was equally merciless. Prisoners were tied to stakes in open fields, while grenades were detonated nearby. Others were forced into bunkers, while flamethrowers roared against their skin. Some were shot with machine guns or bombarded with shrapnel, their wounds carefully measured afterward. The logic was military efficiency. How far could a grenade's fragments penetrate flesh? How effective was a new bomb design? But the reality was human beings reduced to living mannequins, their blood soaking the soil of Manchuria. Sexual violence was also institutionalized. Women prisoners were routinely raped by guards and scientists, not for personal gratification alone, but to create pregnancies for research. Pregnant women were then subjected to vivisections, their fetuses studied for how diseases transferred from mother to child. Some were deliberately infected with syphilis or gonorrhea to observe transmission. In this way, rape itself became another experimental tool, another weapon cloaked under the name of science. The degradation was total. Women stripped of dignity, their suffering reduced to data scribbled in notebooks. But Ishii's ambitions went further. He unleashed plague, cholera, and anthrax on villages, turning entire communities into laboratories of death. Behind every experiment was a person: the farmer swelling with plague, the prisoner cut open on a table, the mother dissected with her unborn child. They were not statistics. They were lives erased. Chillingly, the perpetrators saw themselves as professionals. Doctors debated results like academics. Guards joked during frostbite tests. Cruelty rewarded as progress. Order disguised atrocity. Some confessed to unease, but silence ruled. To resist was treason. In this way, obedience turned healers into executioners and science into a weapon. What made Unit 731 unique was its scale and secrecy. Tens of thousands died in labs, hundreds of thousands in poisoned villages. For survivors, knowing death was certain was itself torture. By 1945, with defeat looming, Ishii burned evidence and executed prisoners. But memory could not be erased. Testimonies, fragments, and ruins exposed what fire could not destroy. The legacy of Unit 731 warns us: the line between healing and harming is thinner than we think. At its core, this story reveals not just the victim's suffering, but the perpetrator's betrayal of humanity. That warning still echoes today. By 1945, the empire that once promised eternal dominion was collapsing. The thunder of Allied bombers echoed across Japanese cities. The Red Army advanced relentlessly through Manchuria, and whispers of surrender crept into even the most hardened military councils. Inside the compound at Harbin, the walls of Unit 731 still stood, but the certainty that had shielded its doctors was crumbling. For the first time, those who had dissected the living and poisoned villages began to fear for their own survival. The question was no longer how to expand their experiments, but how to erase them. Shiro Ishii, the architect of Unit 731, understood this better than anyone. He had risen to power by convincing the empire that disease could be a weapon. Now, as defeat loomed, he used the same cunning to protect himself. He issued frantic orders: burn documents, destroy cultures of bacteria, silence witnesses. Prisoners were executed in groups, their bodies incinerated to ash. Entire cells were emptied in a single night. The men and women who had endured months of horror marched into rooms they would never leave. In those final weeks, the camp became even more terrifying because the end did not bring mercy. It brought annihilation. The destruction was ruthless. Guards poured gasoline on laboratories and set them ablaze. Flames consumed reports, autopsy sketches, photographs of experiments, entire archives that could have revealed the full scale of atrocity. Prisoners who were too sick to move were injected with poisons or shot where they lay. Those who had been used in frostbite tests or vivisections were disposed of quickly, their bodies thrown into furnaces. Ishii wanted no trace left behind, no evidence for outsiders to find. For him, the victims had never been people. In death, they became only liabilities. As the Soviets pushed closer to Harbin, Ishii ordered the staff to abandon the compound. Scientists fled with whatever data they could salvage, tucking away notebooks, vials, and samples. Trucks carried crates of material south toward Japan. Guards melted into the chaos of retreat, some disguising themselves as ordinary soldiers, others vanishing into the countryside. For those left behind, the silence of the camp was overwhelming. The chimneys no longer smoked, the roll calls ceased, the laboratories stood as charred ruins. What remained was emptiness, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow the memory of what had been done. When Soviet troops finally entered the area, they discovered only fragments, a few survivors, skeletal and barely alive, scattered bones buried shallow in the earth, the stench of burned paper and flesh. They could piece together enough to know that something unspeakable had taken place, but Ishii's cover-up had worked well. The scale of the atrocities remained hidden, the full story cloaked in secrecy. What happened next only deepened the betrayal. For while the Soviets documented evidence and later held trials in Khabarovsk, another power saw opportunity in the ashes of Unit 731. The United States, now emerging as a global superpower and already anxious about the Cold War, learned of Ishii's research, and instead of condemning him, they offered him protection. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii and many of his top scientists handed over their findings, data from frostbite tests, plague outbreaks, vivisections. Information gathered through unimaginable cruelty was now treated as valuable intelligence. Think about what that meant. The same men who had dissected prisoners alive walked free, some going on to successful careers in medicine, academia, even business. Ishii himself lived quietly in Japan until his death in 1959, never facing trial, never hearing the verdict he so richly deserved. The victims of Unit 731 were erased twice. First by the flames that destroyed their bodies, then by the silence that shielded their killers. The contrast is staggering. At Nuremberg, Nazi doctors were tried, convicted, and in many cases executed for crimes committed in camps like Dachau and Auschwitz. The world declared that such atrocities would never be tolerated again. But in Asia, the calculus of geopolitics rewrote justice. Because the data might prove useful against the Soviets, because the Cold War had already begun, the crimes of Unit 731 were buried. Progress was purchased with silence, and the screams of the dead were drowned out by the logic of strategy. For the prisoners of Unit 731, survival was never guaranteed. In truth, it was never even expected. The system was designed to consume them, to treat them as expendable fuel for experiments that demanded more bodies than data. And yet, a handful lived. They emerged from the shadows of Harbin not because the system allowed them to, but because chance, resilience, or sheer fate carried them through. Their voices, though few, are the thread that pulls the curtain back, reminding us that behind every statistic was a beating heart, a family, a life interrupted. One survivor later described the moment her father was taken. She was a child in a nearby village when Japanese soldiers arrived. They accused the men of harboring resistance fighters, lined them up, and loaded them onto trucks. Her father never came back. Decades later, she learned he had been taken to the compound, used in plague experiments, and incinerated in its furnaces. She said, "I had no grave to visit, no ashes to hold, only silence, that silence, forced, unnatural, unbearable, haunted entire families. For those who endured the camp itself, testimony is scarcer, because few left alive." One man, captured as a Soviet prisoner of war, recalled the endless roll calls, the hunger, and the fear of being chosen for research. He described hearing screams through the walls, then sudden silence, and the stench of burning flesh that followed. He lived only because he was assigned to menial labor instead of the laboratories. Even in survival, guilt clung to him. Why him, and not the others? Others were not prisoners, but witnesses. Nurses and lower-ranking staff who assisted in the compound later confessed to their roles. Some spoke of delivering trays of infected food to cells, knowing it carried cholera or anthrax. Others described holding down writhing prisoners during vivisections. Many claimed they had no choice, that orders were absolute. But when pressed, some admitted that they buried their unease under silence, telling themselves that obedience was easier than resistance. These confessions reveal another legacy of Unit 731, the moral burden carried not only by victims, but by perpetrators who could never fully escape what they had done. The most haunting testimonies come from women. Pregnant prisoners, subjected to deliberate infections, left no words of their own, but doctors who later confessed revealed that unborn children were dissected alongside their mothers. In one testimony, a scientist admitted to infecting a pregnant woman with syphilis, then removing the fetus to study transmission. "I told myself it was for knowledge," he said, "but knowledge has never weighed so heavy." His words expose the chasm between justification and conscience, a chasm that grows wider with time. Even outside the compound, survivors bore scars. Chinese villages targeted with plague bombs remembered sudden waves of death. Children watched parents swell with fever. Families buried entire households in days. In one village, elders remembered carts carrying bodies to mass graves, the air filled with the buzzing of flies, drawn to sickness. Decades later, survivors described the grief not only of losing loved ones, but of never understanding why it had happened. They knew only that death came from the sky, carried by airplanes they could not stop. Psychological scars ran deeper than physical ones. Survivors often spoke of nightmares, of waking to imagined footsteps outside their doors. Some described being unable to trust doctors ever again, seeing in every white coat the shadow of Unit 731. Others avoided speaking altogether, believing no one would believe them, or fearing reprisal. Silence became its own prison, carried for decades until museums and memorials gave them a place to finally be heard. When the gates of Unit 731 finally stood empty, the world was left with a question that still lingers. How do we reckon with horrors so vast, so calculated, and so hidden? The easy answer is to dismiss them as the work of monsters, to push the story into the realm of aberration. But the unsettling truth is that Unit 731 was not built by monsters. It was built by men. Doctors, scientists, soldiers, people who laughed, who ate meals with their families, who returned home at night convinced they were serving their nation. That truth forces us to see that cruelty is not an alien force. It is something humans are capable of when conscience is smothered by ideology, ambition, or obedience. Reckoning begins with remembrance. The victims of Unit 731 left behind almost nothing. No graves, no photographs, no names etched in stone. Their existence was erased by design. To speak of them now is an act of resistance against that erasure, Every time we recall the man strapped to the table, the mother torn from her child, the villages poisoned from above, we restore a fragment of what was stolen, their humanity. Silence was the weapon of their captors. Memory is our answer. As you listen to this story, ask yourself, what does it mean to be human in the face of such inhumanity? The victims of Unit 731 cannot answer. The perpetrators are long gone. The responsibility is ours. To remember, to question, to resist, to ensure that never again is not just a phrase, but a practice lived every day, because forgetting is the first step toward repetition, and silence, as history has shown us, is the most dangerous weapon of all. So if this story unsettled you, let it unsettle you into action. Talk about it, share it, carry it forward. Make sure that the next generation knows that behind the sterile name, Unit 731, were thousands of lives, fathers, mothers, children, each one of them as real as you and I. If this story moved you, don't let it stay here. Share it. Keep it alive. Because memory is the only weapon we have against the silence that atrocity craves. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.